Thank you, everyone, for joining this roundtable discussion of future of work, the post-COVID-19 work environment. COVID, we've seen that over the past 6 months has not only disrupted the workplace in that time, but is likely to have initiated the durable change in the way we'll be looking at the workplace looking forward. And we need to compose with the fact that diversity and inclusions are getting more and more important every day. But at the same time, due to that pandemic and mandatory or heavily advised remote working conditions, it may seem paradoxical to promote visibility when you are not even seeing your coworkers face to face. And how can you include individuals that are not near you? So Canal Gates Brussels, as a proud member of the Legal Diversity and Inclusion Alliance, assembled a fantastic panel for today, which I will have the pleasure to moderate. My name is Claude-Etienne Armango. I'm a partner at Canal Gates Paris. I'm coordinator for the Data Protection, Privacy and Security Practice Group, and member of Canal Gates Diversity Committee. Along with our fantastic panelists, Annelien, Nigel, and Sunny, we'll attempt to address the conundrum of today. We may not have all the answers today, but at least it starts with asking the right questions. And before each of our panelists introduce themselves, you got a Q&A option in the chat panel. So feel free to address us questions at any given time. We'll try to address them. We try to also divide this session in different sections. So feel free to interact at any given time. And without further ado, Annelien, let's introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Annelien Stratemans. I'm an antitrust lawyer by background, and I've practiced in a big law firm for 6 years. I then moved in-house and started working for AB InBev, a multinational company that you may know from your favorite beers like Stella. And for a year now, I've been working as an in-house counsel for their innovation and startup venture arm, ZX Ventures. I'm also co-chair of Women at Competition, and I care passionately about diversity, not just gender diversity, but also diversity in my glass, because when I'm not lawyering in beer, I'm a sommelier.
I didn't know that. Nigel, if you want to go next.
Hi, well, great to be here. Thank you very much, Claude, and everyone for inviting me today. Nigel Spencer, and my background has been in law firms for about 18 years, where I looked after all the leadership development at Simmons & Simmons and then Reed Smith. So I was at each firm for about 7 years. Did a lot of work at leadership development, whether at the senior level with partners, also a lot of work at graduate level as well, thinking about how we create more rounded skill sets. And in my times at the firm, I actually spent a lot of time focusing on exactly the issue we're talking about today in terms of diversity. So I sat on the international committees we had, did a lot of work also around the talent pipeline. So how do we create and maintain a very diverse talent pool, as not just at recruiting time, but actually as people develop up through the firm. So did a lot of work there for about 15 years. Then I moved to Side Business School in Oxford, where I carried on working on leadership development. Qualified as a coach as well, so I did lots of coaching. And now I'm at Queen Mary University of London Law School, where I'm a professor of professional practice and education innovation. Again, Queen Mary, a very diverse law school as well. So again, very much focusing on that entry to the profession and keeping that broad and how we can make sure the talent pipeline comes through, Claude.
Thank you very much, Nigel. And last but not least, my t-shirt companion, Sunny. You're on mute, Sunny.
I think that's worked. Fantastic. Hi, guys. I'm an intellectual property lawyer based in K&L Gates' London office. I have been in the legal profession now just over 11 years, and I lead the BAME initiative for K&L Gates in London. For me, diversity is sort of being lived every single day. So, events like these are great. I'm looking forward to sort of sharing our collective insights and experiences and thoughts during this webinar with you all. So very excited to be here.
Thank you very much. So let's jump straight in the heart of this. Last week was Mental Health Awareness Week, and we've all seen that during the past 6 months with the remote working conditions, it had an effect not only on the seamlessness of the activity, but also it could cause anxiety, not only because of the pandemic itself, but the stress on the economy, the furlough, and all those indirect consequences can be a disturbance of our mental health in a workplace. So in addition to all that stress, the isolation and the effect on the work-life balance, we seem to be always on. We check our emails when we start our day. We close our day in our bed, checking our emails on our mobile phone. Lawyers are social animals. We are always on, but it seems that we've been even more on. Is it even possible? And how can we find some balance? How can we transition from home to the office and back home when there is no such thing as a physical office? So Sunny, do you want to start with that, and then we can?
Yeah, do you know what? It's a funny one, isn't it? Because we are by nature very social, and sort of that transition as lawyers, for me, it was hard to begin with, because first of all, we're so used to having our routines, going into the office, seeing people, talking about what our day might look like, talking about when our days might not be that great, just popping into the office, and we kind of take that for granted. Then all of a sudden, the pandemic, and certainly here in the UK, lockdown happened so rapidly that when we came to having to work from home, we had our laptops, but actually, I, for one, wasn't 100% prepared for the impact of what working from home long term was going to be like. So that transition of getting your equipment here, getting your monitors, getting your printers, etc., and really starting to make your home an office was weird. I found it quite strange. But then you start to develop these mechanisms. The teams that you're in start meeting online, and you start having these weekly conferences. And our team's great. We have sort of 2-3 times a week we'll meet up and we'll just touch base on what we're doing, but also just how we're doing. How are we doing mentally as well? I should have added that my background is I'm also a practicing doctor. So I've practiced in this pandemic, and I've seen sort of, horrendous things. But what has been amazing outside of the hospital space is trying to see how people have come together, to try and support those who are working from home. But us as lawyers, we're not immune to feeling isolated. I think, a large proportion of us probably have felt isolated at some time. But, we have to try and find other coping mechanisms. For me, I'm still on that sort of journey because, some days are mental at work, and, there'll be weeks you may be working on a particular transaction where it just feels like this is never going to end and there's no one around me that I can just go and just vent to. There's little things that I miss, but then at the same time, I've never felt like I'm so great at my IT skills. Now I'm like, great, I want to talk to someone. Quickly, I will press the button and boom, they will appear on my screen and we can talk. So, you find additional ways to try and navigate this whole weird and strange times that we're in.
But it segues nicely into those coping mechanisms that can also in turn into stress-inducing. Like we're having this panel over video conference, but conversation that could have been taking place over the phone, like you and I, you're in London, I'm in Paris, we're talking on a very regular basis. We used to do that on phone, now we're doing through video conference. So are we getting video conference out? I don't know if anyone wants to address that question. Nigel?
I think it's a really interesting point, Claude, and Sunny, as you described, is your experience over the last few months. I think what's interesting also is the variation in people's experience. And certainly if we're managing a team or we're part of a team, the aspect of almost thinking about the other. So how's the other person feeling? What's their situation like? As you say something, yours was a certain experience setting up at home. Other people, we know, have very different circumstances, whether we're having to now make our office. So there's that challenge actually of difference, I think, Claude, as well, that's added. And as you say, that leads to the thought of, do I want my video on? How does it work for me to have my video on all the time? Or, we go to time zones, we could go to whatever we wanted. There are so many different dimensions to this. It becomes a very complicated thing.
Yeah, and I think also in the very beginning, when everybody started working from home, I noticed that there was this almost natural urge to try and replicate our normal way of working, but virtually. And I saw a lot of initiatives. Some were super creative, but like early morning training sessions that were facilitated by workplaces. You had virtual coffees, you had virtual lunch breaks, you had virtual seminars, you had virtual happy hours. And I think, now that we're months into the pandemic, I think people are starting to realize a bit more like what is appropriate to move virtual and what is actually time that we should just give back to people. And I think that's a little bit the paradox of this blurring of boundaries, because I do agree that for a number of people, they feel like work never stops. But I think as legal professional, I think we are all familiar with this idea that work never stopped. And this is not because of the pandemic. I think a lot of us already had that feeling before. And I, for one, feel that when I work from home, because I'm not physically in an office and I'm not physically drawn into a meeting room at the very last minute when I was actually about to go home, it gave me power back to structure my day as in how I wanted it to. And I think that's a challenge, and particularly for more junior team members, how can we show them that they should take that power back and structure their day? How can we make sure that people see that, if you're not in the office and you don't have to have lunch with your colleagues, how can you make lunch something where you can take energy from? Can you go have lunch with someone that you care about, your friends or your family? Or do you take it and you go for a run, for example, whereas you may not have done that when you were stuck in an office? And I think there's a lot of things that we can change in our day-to-day work, which will actually make working from home a more empowering experience.
Hopefully that's not just wishful thinking, and we'll be able to put that together. The sentence like having lunch outside is bringing fond memories of when we could do that. And since we prepared that roundtable, the bars in Paris have closed. I heard that in Brussels it was also starting to close again. So we may be in this for quite a while. And Annelien, you raised a question that was interesting. The fact that employers feel somewhat compelled to organize or at least reach out to their employees. It's been the same in the early days when we saw a lot of service providers that were doing some outreach very actively. I would almost use the term aggressively. Maybe it was fear of missing out something, but it raised the question, should we really be friends or intermingle for non-work related things with our coworkers? And once again, how do we strike a balance between being together for our job, but also preserving that bubble of personal space?
Well, I think it's not necessarily yes or no question. I see two things. I think in this new world, I think a lot of us now have the opportunity to take a step back and actually see how much time and energy they spend in a professional context. And I think for some of us, it can be quite an existential journey almost to see, okay, is my identity, my social life, is everything tied to my work? and is now maybe a good time to start building a part of my identity or myself outside of work. So, and I see that happening to various degrees with my friends and in my close circles. So I think as people are going through that journey, they will start to use more time for those more intentional, deliberate relationships and move away from relationships that are there simply because you happen to sit next to someone at work. But I would say on the other side, obviously, when you still spend a lot of time working, which I'm sure we all do, I think it's important to bring the humanity and the friendliness, I would say, back into your day-to-day professional interactions. And what I mean by that is, I think we've operated for a long time on the model that you could have very quick, sometimes brusque, or even sometimes rude interactions at work, and then you would kind of make it up by going on a happy hour with your colleagues. And I think there's also, and I'm saying it like in a very, caricature way, but I think there's a way of bringing that humanity, that friendliness, that kind of building the relationship into the more day-to-day emails that you exchange with your colleagues, or even WhatsApp messages, or however you communicate, and same with external counsel. So if I look at it from a client point of view, I would prefer to build a relationship with the people that I work with through having very productive, congenial, collegiate exchanges during work hours. And that may then mean that we don't need to have whining and dining of clients anymore. Don't get me wrong, I like that. But it goes back to my earlier point. If I could choose to spend a dinner with my partner or my friends or my family, I may prefer that over my law firms. And so I think, it's all part of this big, in my view, rebalancing that's happening. How do we interact in a professional context? How do we reclaim some more space for personal and intentional relationships? And I think ultimately everyone will benefit from that.
I think the key word in what you're saying is intentional. So it matters to be deliberate, and the excess that I highlighted before were more or less untargeted. It was trying to reach out just for the sake of doing something. So, Nigel, could you elaborate on maybe the informal exchange? How can we translate these tiny nuances? Annelien was talking about going for happy hour to diffuse the tension. How can we translate, or should we not translate it, but just create something out of thin air for that remote work environment?
So I think we're talking about some really interesting stuff here. I think, Annelien, you were saying there, is that thought of when do the conversations focus on a task and when do they focus on a relationship? And I think that whole balance of how we build personal connection, as you say, whether it's, as you say, with clients, especially, so with your client hat on, all the relationship building training that one does, and again, the focus on building trust. What is it? Part of it's about building personal connection. And so how do you get that balance right? Paul, to answer that question around how I've seen it done and how I think you need to be a little bit more, we've talked about being intentional there, and I think you're dead right, because where, as you say, Annelien, where you used to be sitting next to each other, that doesn't exist so much anymore. So how do you know it's okay? How do you know that your trainee, or if you're the trainee, how do you know, how do you make that connection with the senior person, just to pick that sort of relationship? So I've heard some great examples where firms are actually using technology. So instant messaging is something I've heard has worked really, really well, actually, of people saying, do you know what, it's great because I can see when they're free on the little color coding thing. So I know when I can pick up, I can press that, as you said, that call button and actually have a quick word with them about something. I've heard lots of great stories about buddying schemes that have taken place. I think, something that's been commented on in the press the last few months is, if you have your networks already and you're part of a firm or a commercial business, that's good. If you're a new joiner, how does that work? And that's not just at junior level, but that's actually at senior level. So I think there's something there about onboarding and helping people navigate around an organization especially at this time, super tricky in some senses. But I think then that, Claude, comes back to the point I said, you used the word intentional, and that's the word I was going to use. I'll jot it down, deliberate. So that thought of actually being very deliberate and say, okay, when am I having my check-in on the matter I'm working on, so that, I know that it's progressing well? How am I checking in? Again, let's go back to relationship. How am I checking in that they're okay from a mental health point of view? So how do you almost structure that a little bit, just so you know that you're covering off all the angles, I would say, Claude, but deliberate or intentional, I think, is a nice way of thinking about it.
And it's also a matter of finding the balance, because if you overreaching to people, that can have the opposite effect.
Completely. Yeah.
And as part of the preparation for this roundtable, Annelien, you related a very surprising experience that relates to diversity and how there may be some unequal effect of the remote working condition, but not the way we would expect in terms of ritual when going into the war room or meeting between gender.
Yeah, so, and I know it's very poor statistics if you start drawing conclusions from a very personal experience, but so
it's empirical.
It's empirical indeed. But so what I've noticed is that since working from home, people have to be, and I come back to the same word, very deliberate on how they structure their meetings and exchanges. And so informal hallway chatter has disappeared because, well, we don't bump into people like that anymore. And what that has done, in my view, is it has kind of dismantled informal networks that exist within large organizations. And I mean, it's not going to come as a surprise to anyone that those informal networks typically favor what I would call the in-group. And in most organizations, the in-group is still white males. So what that has led to is, I think, people that have not typically belonged to the in-group are much more likely to be included in conversations that they would have been excluded from before. And it sits in very small details. Like, for example, if a discussion needs to happen and people now have to schedule a Zoom call or a WebEx, that allows for all of the participants to invite other people because they may think actually that person is relevant to the conversation. So you don't have this closed off discussion sphere that you would otherwise have if you just randomly run into someone in the hallway and you start pre-aligning before you walk into a meeting. And you can actually have strategies to pre-align and then kind of pre or front run the outcome of the meeting. I see those type of dynamics that has kind of fallen away. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good thing that we've become a bit more structured around the discussions and meetings that we have. I also think it's a good thing that there's a bit of a barrier before we have a meeting so that not everything is being chatted about. It's a bit more, again, back to the same word, it's a bit more intentional. People can come prepared to meetings and people can come to a meeting and the meeting is a bit of a blank slate because of all of that informal pre-alignment hasn't happened. So everyone gets an equal chance. And I think especially with Zoom, where everyone just appears in the same size, that also has an equalizing impact on a meeting, because you don't have that typical thing where you have the most senior person sitting on one side of the table and then the whole room goes like this. And then whoever is sitting on the other side of the table is not seen or heard. So I do think that when it comes to gender diversity, and I would actually broaden it to all kinds of diversity, that simply because we are now all working from home and we have to schedule virtual meetings and we see each other in the same size on the screen, that meetings have become more inclusive.
Well, it's certainly a word of hope. We were talking about anxiety before, and I hope that the discussion we had were not anxiety generating, but at least now we've got something to look forward to, and the great leveling the playing field. And that segues nicely to Sunny. You and I have been exchanging in the past with regard to the firm diversity effort, and that you've been like Eileen said, that um, the new working condition could be an opportunity for outreach, for inclusion, and promote initiatives that maybe sometimes were lost in the office place.
You know what? You're right. I think just sort of picking up on what Annalise said on mental health. I think this whole transition has made us rethink who we are as individuals. I'm just going to touch base slightly on what's already said, but for me, for example, I initially felt like I had to always be online and very present when I was working from home, which sounds a bit bizarre. But I think a lot of people, when they work from home, will think actually we'll probably work more. For me, I've had to try and work out actually this isn't good for my mental health, because what I'm doing is I'm spending so much time looking at a computer. I don't actually know who I really am outside of my identity as a lawyer. And I've had to kind of rediscover myself. So as part of our mental health initiatives, what's been really interesting is I think K&L's been very good, and I've heard other businesses have as well, are sort of saying to their staff and their colleagues that it's okay that you might feel that you've kind of lost who you are. And this is all part of an approach trying to address mental health issues, but also who are you type issues, because you're stripping away every part of your life, which is the key bit, which is your work, because we're spending 90% of our lives at work. We are there all the time. Everything in our social circles tend to be revolved in some way around work. And now you're stripped away of all of that. So what I've really enjoyed seeing is these novel ways firms and businesses have tried to start engaging with their employees. For us, let's take Mental Health Awareness Week. I mean, before it might have been more generated off the back of clients wanting to see this, but now it's really important that the key resource to the firm is appreciated, which is the staff, the lawyers, those in business services. So let's invest in these people. These are all the things that we can help you with. These are the facilities that are available to you. But also, here is a list of buddies. And I know that we've been doing that a lot more now, especially in London, saying that these are mental health buddies, these are people you could talk to. And it's encouraging people to talk about these issues, not just during a given week like Mental Health Week or Black History Month. It's actually about, this is going on for a long time. Let's start changing fundamentally and structurally our organizations. And I think it's provided a very needed way to engage with personnel. I've always thought in the legal world, we've been behind the professional service providers, say like your accountancy firms, etc., by at least almost like a decade in some respects. But in this rare opportunity, we are trying to now, we are always given us a natural way to sort of just jump ahead. And I'm looking forward to seeing what comes out. If I take our initiatives in BAME, for us, this is the first time we formed a BAME group within K&L Gates in London. We have a very good diversity committee, but it's actually given me the opportunity to sit down and think, what is it that we actually need to be doing from a graduate recruitment, not just how we recruit, but then how we're retaining and how we're empowering those people we work with, and thinking about how do we add value to these people. And I think this has all happened more off the back of, knowing how valuable your resource is, as opposed to saying this is in alignment with what clients are doing, which used to be the primary. I think it's now the primary within our firm of let's focus on us as individuals. And you will have seen, Claude, in the multiple, amazing sort of, discussions on race or conversations on race program that we're doing at the moment from the States. And I think it's really interesting how we're sort of engaging in new ways. And it would be interesting to know actually from Annalie if anything like that's happening internally at Debbie and Bev or anything like that at all.
Yeah, the conversation on diversity, especially after everything that happened with Black Lives Matter, and it's been very alive. But I think at the same time we're still grappling also as an organization. How do we do more than just talking about it? How do we fundamentally rethink how we approach recruitment? And it's, again, I'm just repeating what you and Nigel have already said. Like, how do we fix the pipeline? How do we make sure that people also feel at home and want to stay with our organization? And I mean, at the end of the day, it is extremely challenging if the decision makers are not diverse themselves yet, right? And I don't like to refer to people as people are never diverse, but as a group, they are still pretty homogenous. So it is extremely challenging. But one thing that I wanted to pick up on is that when hearing all of this, I'm actually thinking, none of this is very new. So this idea of how do you bring on board new people? How do you make sure that they feel at home? How do you address very tiny questions that they may have that they may feel don't warrant setting up a Zoom meeting, but still they need to know, for example, how does this tool work, or how do I file my expenses, and all of these kind of things. For me, it's actually community engagement in the original social media sense. And I think people that are well versed in e-commerce or social media, they will know that that's a dedicated function within any organization that's trying to engage a community around a certain thing. It can be a service, a good, can be a workplace. It's someone who is very deliberate about how do we bring people on board, make them feel at home, how do we set a tone of voice, how do we set a culture, or how do we let people see and experience what our culture is, and how do we kind of create these group norms together? And I think as organizations, as physical organizations, for the longest time, we've relied on literally forcing people in a physical space and having them observe how other people do things. And that's been the way to communicate the culture. It's literally having people live through it. But if you look at very vibrant online communities, that's not how they do it. There's usually a very clear, almost written out, again, very deliberate document that kind of sets out, if you want to join our forum or if you want to join our group, these are the rules of the game. And then you have people actually moderating. So if people overstep in terms of tone or the way they react to certain things, then someone will step in and be just very explicit, saying, this is not how our members act, or this is not a topic that is appropriate for this forum, go there. It's very, very clear. And so I think one of the things that we as physical organizations will need to do is thinking about how do we make our culture clear, and how can we then communicate that effectively to people rather than just having them live through it. And we all kind of know or think we know what the culture is. But I also think in reality, if you would ask different people in the same organization, they may have a very different idea of what the culture is. So I think this is, again, a great opportunity to kind of bridge that gap, be extremely deliberate about the culture, find ways to communicate that effectively, see if it works when you onboard new people, and then actually bring everybody on the same level playing field. So making sure that everyone has a similar understanding of what is this culture. Maybe final point on that, I also think, on the one hand, you can be extremely deliberate. On the other hand, culture is also something that you can convey in day-to-day interactions, whether they are online or in the real world. I think ultimately that's how the culture manifests itself. And again, you don't need to be in the same physical space to do that. You can, people see also how other people write emails or work on documents, and I think that's where the culture then actually lives. I think being super deliberate at the outset, I think is important. And again, there's a lot of examples out there of online communities who have done that very successfully.
I think, Claude, I think there's so many interesting points there, Annelien. And as you say, how does culture show itself? What do we notice? And you know, perhaps in the environment we've lived through the last few months, Sunny, your comments as well, the thoughts of, you know, do we show our culture by giving feedback regularly, by reaching out to people, by making ourselves available, by giving them the opportunity and the permission, I think, as we've all been saying, to almost have those, you know, create those boundaries where they want to as well. So, as you say, all those elements of culture are interesting. And as you say, you know, we notice it around an office because it's role modeling, and we say, that's how you behave when you're running a meeting or something like that, or that's how, you know. But I think the hierarchy point on Zoom is fascinating because you say everyone, I think, Sunny, you were saying this, everyone's the same size on the screen, which is fascinating. So, you know, if you're a senior person, that one, you know, how often do I give the most junior person the opportunity to speak first in a meeting? You know, for one bit of work we did on a leadership program, that was the key change, actually, the organization made. They said, we're too hierarchical and we need to almost change the feel of the culture of almost who has permission to give ideas. It's that point of psychological safety. It goes back to innovation a bit, Claude, which I think we've touched on in thinking about this session as well. How do you get innovation in a culture? Well, that's about, do people feel permission to fail, actually, when things don't go 100% right, to come up with an idea, try something, and okay, brilliant idea, and actually we evolve it for next time. So what is okay, as you say, Annalene, in terms of the culture? I think it has so many different interesting elements to it.
And maybe also raising another type of diversity and inclusion that should be kept in mind, which is the great technological divide, and how to ensure that people got the same level playing field conditions to work at home. Some people, like for instance, we haven't seen a cat in the background of each of our panelists, but it's become something very normal. There hasn't been kids crying for lunch. But the working conditions at home are different. Like there is no the safe haven that work could be. I'm just going to make a pause here because we're almost at the end of the official talk. It's so many discussions to segue from that. And so if you got any question, feel free to use the Q&A panel, and we relay that to our panelists. But if there is not, like, let's use that time to address the other aspects. Feel free to reach out at any time in the Q&A section, and let's go back to that technological and also social to some extent. I've got an associate that is sharing a flat, and it's become difficult for her and her flatmate to have calls. One has to be in the kitchen while the other is in the living room. So how can we address that? How can we facilitate that?
Claude, just one thought just to add in as well, again, about being intentional, that relates to this aspect of different situations, and also the relationship and the social aspect is, I think work allocation is an interesting issue here as well. How do we get inclusion around, you know, there's often discussion around that in practice groups when we're in offices as well, but I think that's an interesting, and I think Annalene, you touched on some of those thoughts of, you know, how do we make sure stuff is shared around as well, so that people can stretch and develop as well. And Claude, I think that's a really important issue as well in terms of inclusion too.
But and I must say, I think the being able to peer inside people's homes when they dial in on Zoom, I think I really enjoyed it because it gives a touch of humanity and also vulnerability to the people that you're used to seeing in a suit in a clean office space. And if you think about it, I mean, the way it was before, it's kind of artificial, right? It's almost, when people are in an office setting, it's as if they don't have a family, they don't have worries outside of work. You know, they're always mintly dressed, haircuts and all of that. And I think during the pandemic, you start seeing people as they are. You start seeing people as people. And I think that, again, is a great equalizer. I do recognize that it's also something that takes away, I would say, that kind of subtle power that comes with wearing a suit. But I like that because I think it's, I think it equalizes. But the point that you make, Claude, obviously is a very valid one, that presumes also that people have a comfortable place that they can work from. And I think well, let's see what will happen to the real estate market, but you can already see some of the fallout of the more working from home is that people just decide, you know what, I don't want to live in the center of a big city anymore where they have to share a flat. I will just move to a place where I can have a 2-bedroom with an office. And I don't care if I then for the few times that I need to commute, then it'll be a longer commute, but I don't care. So I'm super curious actually to see whether people will also rearrange in the same way that the role of the office will change. I think the role of the home will change, and I think people's living situations will slowly but steadily adapt to that new world as well.
No, I completely agree, and I think this is a really interesting point, Anneleen, internationally as well. You know, there's all the different cities where we've all read about in the press, as you say, what is the normal living, because of rental prices, for example, what does the normal home space look like in this city or that city or that city? It's, as you say, it's very different, you know, let alone people have talked about the seniority or junior people having different situations, but internationally that's very different as well. And then we go into the business services teams. You know, there's all of these different aspects, which is, as you say, but I agree with you, it's going to be fascinating to see what comes out of this in terms of patterns. You know, it takes you on to things like, you know, how will you know, train companies, how will ticketing work, how will commuting work in the future? I mean, it's fascinating. Yeah, all these changes.
And if you unravel all that, like, do we need to have the physical space of the office in a similar structure? Should we move to a more like WeWork type of an assigned desk? And how can you manage this on the one hand, and sometimes confidentiality when you're in a regulated industry? And for the first time, it might be the same in London, but for the first time in ages, like the price of real estate in Paris has gone down. So is that a trend? Is that a fad? Are offices here to stay for real, or what does it mean for the future?
Yeah, I think the role of the office will fundamentally change. I think that's clear. I think, and we were already on that trajectory. I think the epidemic has just accelerated. But so going into an office to just sit behind your own desk and do your own work and then go home in the evening, I think that's a completely outdated model, and I don't think that will persist. I think people will come to the office to meet other people, to have face-to-face meetings, to be creative, to workshop, and then when the actual work needs to be done, when the documents need to be drafted, the slides need to be presented or made, then I think people just go home and do that from the comfort of their home. And I think it plays into this big rebalancing. I think that would be the nice middle ground, right? Because then you allow for that physical interaction every once in a while, but you also preserve the productivity, which frankly has been lost a little bit with open spaces and, you know, the constant interruptions. And I mean, I realize that I probably speak to people who all still have their own office in law firms, but I think in a lot of companies, that's no longer the case. So actually working from home was very refreshing in that, you could just work uninterrupted.
I think the other thing, sorry,
go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it's also, it might be different for different groups, because, you know, there will be fundamentally a lot of, say, older partners in the firms who actually really enjoy having that time coming into the office and having a complete cut-off from everything outside of the workplace. And indeed, you know, as I think a lot of people, I for one have got a little bit lockdown or pandemic fatigued, and I am starting to miss, I miss my office. But I think it will be more likely that there will be this sort of hybrid where we will be going back to have that sort of collaboration time with our colleagues, being in our offices, but at the same time being able to work from home as and when we choose. I mean, that would be the ideal outcome. How that then actually factors into how law firms' real estate spaces are going to be needed in the sizes of which they are right now, that's another question. You know, will they halve in space because they just weren't populated? I mean, for example, my old law firm, it was on The Lawyer yesterday, you know, they've got this sort of team A, team B type situation where team A can go in one week, team B the other week. And actually, it's just not been a huge uptake on it. So they've just scrapped that altogether. But I do think there are going to be pockets of within our businesses who actually like the office time. That's all. And conversely, families, mothers with children, fathers with children enjoy that time working from home because they get to do the school run and they get to be there for breakfast and bedtime. So, you know, it's going to be very difficult to try and cater for every single person. If this was my world, it would literally be, you know, we have the office space, we have offices available for hot desking, but actually work from home as and when you need to, because this pandemic has forced us into at least it will be a year's worth of working from home, and we've developed mechanisms, strategies of how to deal with things. We've kind of got through most of the technical issues by the time we probably are in the place to return back to work. That's just...
And Sunny, that idea of the new model there just takes me to the thought of, what does it mean? And we've talked about culture. What does it mean to be part of a firm? You know, what does it mean to be part of a big global firm? And it's been fascinating the last 10 years, certainly in the UK with the deregulation, how lots of different types of law firms and legal service providers have started. So what does it mean to be part of K&L Gates? What does it mean to be part of this type of business? What does it mean to be that type of, and all those different models? It's fascinating. I think it's fascinating what lies ahead.
I think we also have a couple of questions in the meantime.
Yeah, so one of the questions is tied nicely to what Sunny was wishing. But if you do have the hot desking in a physical office and also the home office, that also means the IT infrastructure must be able to support all this. So is there a duty by employers to provide employees with the same playing conditions, which is like a certain number of screens, proper chairs, printers? Like I had to run to the office yesterday just because I needed to print documents I could not possibly read on a screen. So there are some limitation to what you can do at home. And is that the duty of the employers to address them? Whoever wants to take that one.
Well, Claude, I was going to say, I know that some firms have actually addressed that. I think I've seen, going back to some things you've seen in the press, Sunny. I mean, I remember seeing in the press some stuff that some firms had put out budgets out there for people to do exactly that, to answer that question. So is it beholden on the employer to do that? Well, it goes back, you mentioned productivity, Annalene, so that takes us to that interesting thought as well. How can I set up my space? But then it's complicated because, do you want your living room? I mean, I'm sitting here where I'm sitting in my house at the moment. How much stuff would the rest of my family be really happy that isn't appearing on the dining room table or something? So it's complicated. It's very complicated.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there's more and more companies that actually allocate budgets, and some actually quite significant. It's something that we also do, especially I think picking up on the question that Kat put out, when it comes to making sure that people don't physically harm themselves when working from home. People hunching over their laptops or working from a coffee table, but actually having a desk that they can sit upright, having a comfortable chair, having a second screen. I think, it is ultimately the responsibility of the employer, especially if, there's a conscious decision on the side of the employer that working from home should become the default or should be done more. And I think a decision like that comes with a responsibility to your employees to make that happen. I also see a question from Natalie on, I guess, that some people don't like the idea of having other people look into their living room or look into the space that they are working from. I fully agree. And I think what is nice is that most of the WebEx, Zoom technology allows people to blur their background so that, if they don't want to show where they are dialing in from, that's perfectly fine. And I think, people can also still dial in without video. I think obviously that should be a choice of the people. I guess my point was more, I really don't mind if people dial in and, it's not a typical office setting, but you see something else in the background. I think that's just my personal preference.
Well, Annalene, on that point as well, just to chip in, Claude, I'd say that it's interesting when I'm doing coaching and, do I often use video or do I not use video? And I often find you can have a very deep level of conversation actually with, sometimes no visuals is actually very helpful for actually really focusing on some of the things you're actually being told. And you can almost hear a lot of things. You can hear the emotion, you can hear that, without necessarily the visual cues. And especially if there's a delay on the video or something like that, sometimes it's much better actually in terms of the quality of conversation, I would say. So I think there are, lots of elements to that as well.
I totally agree. And I'm actually thinking in the same way that we would now subconsciously have places and situations to have certain conversations, where if you have a tough conversation, you may not do it, you may not call someone in your office, but you may take them for a coffee, or, we as humans, we already know how to structure our conversations. And I think in my view, it's going to be a matter of time before we all get used to those more virtual interactions. And I think then too, we will be able and equipped to see, okay, now is maybe not appropriate to have a video call. Let's just do a voice call, or maybe let's have a chat over WhatsApp or an instant messaging service so people can think a bit longer about what they write back instead of having an instant live conversation. I think, that ability to decide which technological form of communication is best, I think we'll only get better at that. So I do think I think it's a very important point that Natalie is making, and I think we'll all become better at making sure that we strike the right balance.
These are really, really fascinating topics, and hopefully what we touched on today laid the foundation for reflection, because the direction of the change is unlikely to change. Like, it's forward, and hopefully it's forward and upward. We're judging to the conclusion of our session. Would you like each a final word with regard to the paradigm shift that we've been encountering, and a word of hope?
I'll chip in, first of all. So certainly I think it offers new opportunities. The other thing I would, again, with my coaching hat on, I suppose I would really encourage people to do is, let's really focus on the quality of our listening at these times and in this environment that we're working in, whether it's listening for how the other person's doing, listening to how the other person, what they need from us, as if we're working with them, if we're collaborating. So I think big opportunities, as we've discussed. Let's think about being intentional with the culture, and let's focus on the quality of our listening. I'll leave us with that from me.
And I would say, I think the big opportunity that this crisis brings, I think it's important that the people that are ready to jump and grasp the opportunity are considerate enough for people that may not be ready to immediately challenge or to immediately take that opportunity. I don't know if I'm making sense, but it actually relates also to my response to Natalie's question. It's that I think making sure that no one is left behind in this transition to a more virtual world, be it, because of work circumstance or because of digital literacy, but making sure that we bring everyone along on the journey to hopefully reset the balance of how we work and live.
And actually, just on the back of that, I think it's really important for us as those of us who are managers and have juniors in our team, that we are bringing them along, because I think it has been invaluable when we were all trainees back in the day, to be in the office, to be actually surrounded by lawyers, listening to their calls, discussing things there and then. And all of a sudden, we've had these influx of junior lawyers are coming through who will miss out on that valuable opportunity. So you're making sure we're interacting with them. It should be our responsibility, and it should be our intent to think of, are we touching base regularly enough? How are we helping develop and promote them within the firm? The other thing is, I think it's just making for us all to be listening to what each other's saying, exactly what Nigel's saying, but also what we're trying to work out who we are as well in this, and not getting lost. I think there's a real sense that, you know, through this we have transitioned to something completely new, and we have to try and discover again who we are. So listen to yourself, take the time out. You know, there's no one around to see what time you came in the office or what time you didn't. We are all adults. We should be able to have that confidence in our abilities and our managing our time, to also try and carve out some time for us. And I think that's something I've been guilty of before, but now I'm actively trying to do that, and it will be better for my mental health, and I'm hoping for others too. So that's my final thoughts.
Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a fantastic panel. And let's keep the conversation going. Sophia?
Many thanks, Claude, Annelien, Nigel, and Sunny, for the amazing insights that you provided us in a topic which appears to be one of the most discussed topics nowadays, the future of work in terms of diversity and inclusion. So my name is Sofia Karagianni. I'm a policy lawyer at the Brussels K&L Gates office. And on behalf of the organizing committee, I would like to sincerely thank you for joining us in our first event. Before we close, I would like very shortly to offer some concluding remarks on what actually the future of work means in terms of diversity and inclusion from the perspective of a junior millennial professional. So I believe that the digital workplace is actually making us, as our amazing speaker said, question a lot of things that we once took for granted. And particularly for the younger generations that joined law firms recently, I think that it makes us question, what does work mean for us if we do possess the right skill set to actually thrive in this new normal? And at the end of the day, if we really want to work in an office, or we do not need an office at all. However, there is something that makes me very excited about the future of work. And this is that diversity and inclusion are actually two crucial components of success in this new workplace. And I think that it's arguably even more important when one takes into account that we don't have regular in-person interaction with our colleagues. However, what I would like to point out from a perspective of a millennial is that where actually law firms fail sometimes is in understanding why actually inclusion is different than diversity. Because it's possible that a law firm hires a diverse workforce, but if this workforce does not actually feel embraced, they do not feel supported by the partners, they will not feel empowered to drive change and share their perspectives. And I think that this is where the future of work, and particularly technology, can help law firms create a culture of inclusion where actually everyone participates and everyone works together for the same goals. In this context, I believe that another aspect that attention should be paid when it comes to diversity and inclusion initiatives, it's what is called generational diversity. I think that all the law firms who are participating in this event today, they have hired people who represent different generations, from baby boomers to Generation Z. So one key challenge is how actually to address the diverse digital habits of these different generations in order to thrive and attract this multi-generational talent. And the last thing that I believe it's very crucial, and I think that law firms can actually play a very significant role, is training actually all the lawyers on the future of work and giving them a skill cluster which actually complements people in digital skills. I like to call this skill cluster the growth mindset skills, which I think becomes increasingly more important in the VUCA times we live. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And the good thing is that this cluster is comprised of skills such as flexibility, adaptability, resilience, and grit. And even though educational institutions, law schools particularly, often struggle to equip us with this skill set, right now it's easy to each of us to develop these skills and prepare for the future of work. And we can develop these skills either in the context of the firm or through using online medium like Coursera. And this is exactly where the COVID pandemic, which actually might be a challenging time for most of us, can also offer an unprecedented opportunity to develop our growth minds and skills and becoming better prepared for future crises. So concluding the event, I think that if 2020 taught us anything, it's that we cannot predict, let alone control the future. So our best bet is to go forward as an inclusive group. And I believe that this time we lawyers are going to be on the forefront of the future of work, since some concepts that are very dear to us, like employment and taxation norms, are going to change. So people who will be working in this new normal will be craving for our advice. And as Winston Churchill once said, we should not let a crisis go to waste. And this time, the crisis of the future of work provides us the opportunity to actually reassess our skills, determine the current needs of the legal market, and actually create roadmaps to bridge any gaps that might surface between the two. So many thanks for attending today. It was very nice online seeing you all. And let's keep the conversation going on the future of work. Have a nice evening, everybody.